Hi, I'm John Cuddeback.
And I'm Sofia Cuddeback.
If you're wondering whether you can really be friends with your spouse
and raise children into responsible adults with whom you have a relationship,
and do what it takes to make a homestead, reconnecting with your body and the land wherever you live.
If you just want to think more about how to make a truly happy home in our trying times,
then the Intentional Household, a LifeCraft podcast, is for you. Join us. Today's episode is household. What are we making together anyway? Now, this was actually Sofia's idea, and I liked this idea, but I'm interested, maybe you could just begin by telling us why you thought this would be a good topic, Sofia.
Yeah, I think part of the thing that inspired me to do this as a podcast is this notion is actually very present in your work on your LifeCraft website. And you've done a lot of video shorts, you've written a lot about it in your blog, but I'm realizing there are probably a lot of people who are listening to the podcast and encountering your work for the first time through the podcast. And I kind of feel like everything else that we're talking about in the podcast really has to be understood in the light of this understanding of the household. And so I thought it would be a good way for us to introduce our podcast audience to what is in fact kind of a core idea of your whole work on family and household at LifeCraft. So I thought that'd be a good idea.
Well, I like that idea very, very much. And I couldn't agree more that household is the central notion. And it is indeed a notion that we don't think about this the way that people used to. And of course, my introduction to it was especially by studying the ancients and seeing what an amazingly rich understanding of household that they have. And it really... you don't realize what a difference it makes until you really start to dig into it a little bit. So where should we begin?
I think one of the challenges actually is that household is still a word that's just very commonly in use in our vocabulary. If it were a little bit more rarefied, maybe, people would say, what are you talking about, household? But I think because we use the word household quite frequently in a very pedestrian way, we're just so used to it that we don't think about it very much. Kind of in the same way that the whole notion of two people falling in love and getting married and starting a family and living in a house together, raising those kids is very familiar to all of us. Although, of course, it's being threatened so much more these days, which is why I think it's very important and worthwhile for us to be asking this question more in depth, more intentionally. I think that's one of the challenges is that we're so used to that word. And so I'd love for you to just share a little bit about the insights that you got from reading the ancients on household and kind of give a little bit of nuance to what is otherwise a very pedestrian word in our vocabulary.
Good. Okay, I like that. And when we say, if we succeed in doing a decent job at this, then this really could change one's understanding at a very fundamental level of what marriage is, what marriage is kind of about, what spouses do, and that's why we ended up titling it that way, right? What are we making together anyway?
Yeah,
so let's have that in the back of our minds. I always love to go back to the key question, what is a man proposing to a woman when he, quote, proposes to her? And I think that is really worth our taking a very close look at. Again, we can't tend to take it for granted, but it's actually something that I think we've gotten away in many ways. Even those who think more about these things and consider themselves to be kind of having that traditional sense of marriage and family, there's actually a bit here that is missing that we can fill in our understanding and thus really enrich our understanding of marriage and the whole realm of raising children.
Yeah, I think that word propose is kind of like the word household. When we say a man proposes to a woman, everybody knows exactly what's just happened. But the meaning of the word propose means to come to someone with an idea, explain the idea, so to speak, and say, what do you think? Are you going to say yes? And so it's kind of interesting etymologically to think about the word. It kind of stands in for a concept. But I think it's helpful to actually look at the meaning of the word because it gives us greater insight into actually kind of a fuller understanding of the concept itself.
Well, and here's the thing. We're not going to be able to make it so that any miscellaneous 20-odd-year-old person who is proposing will have a crystal clear conception of what he's proposing. But nonetheless, it certainly could go a long way to helping men who are looking at marriage and women who are looking at marriage to think more specifically, concretely, practically about just what it is that they're thinking about doing. And of course, many of our listeners now joining us in this conversation are already married. And regardless of what exactly they were or were not proposing and saying yes to at the time that they got married, we can work together to think a little bit more clearly about it.
Yeah.
So household. The thing that really struck me in reading Aristotle is that he says, first of all, that's a natural community. And a community established by nature. This already says much. We don't have to linger here, but this gives a kind of baseline in a key, a theme to our whole thinking about it. In talking about family, talking about household, we are talking about something that we're not making up, that we're discovering an order, a plan in nature. This was absolutely Aristotle's view, that it springs from what it means to be human. So from the start, it's like, okay, it makes it be a little bit of a treasure hunt, and you got to dig. We got to look. We got to unfold, because it ends up being very complex and multifaceted, even if in its fundamental lines it's rather straightforward.
So when you say a treasure hunt, you mean hunting to find out what is actually the design of nature.
That is exactly is exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So it's a natural community, and then the immediate next thing that he says is a natural community established for the sake of everyday life. Another way that he puts that is meeting everyday needs. And I really like this. There's a lot to think about here when you think, what do human persons need every day? And again, we don't have to go really deeply into this philosophy, but just to start to set out the lines of it. Obviously, there's a very material aspect of that, but not only a material aspect, there's also a kind of spiritual / moral / psychological aspect of what are the daily needs of human persons. Clearly, immediately, Aristotle's thinking in terms of, hey, just practically speaking, that you get together in households in order to produce the things that you need, that you're going to eat together, you're going to sleep under the same roof, you're going to have shelter. It's interesting to note that now, and this is a theme we have to consider, many aspects that the ancients, or even those who came not nearly so long before us, would have considered natural, because this is the way all households are, isn't necessarily so obvious to us because of the changes in technology. Now we have a situation where you can have, as it were, many other options. It's not so much the case as it would have been 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago that, well, kind of what else would one do than live in a household that has a certain structure to it. So things that were more obviously natural to them are not so obviously natural to us. So
I just wanted to pause and just ask you to, so let me see. Sometimes it's hard for me to keep the thread together. So if I were giving kind of a concise definition of household, according to Aristotle, it's a community
established by nature.
It's a community established by nature for the sake of meeting everyday needs.
You can say for the sake of meeting everyday needs, and then what we would want to add to that its kind of origin and its root is in marriage. So he takes this. He never, by the way, just kind of says, "Here's my definition." So you got. Well, sometimes he does for other things, but this one we kind of have to piece together. The most direct statement is where he says, "It's this a community established by nature for the sake of meeting everyday needs." But then it's very much also in the context of, this is the community that immediately comes about when someone gets married. In other words, it's what naturally grows from a marriage. And so, but part of the reason that it's tricky in how you define it, because of course you can have a household in some sense where there is no marriage. And so again, we're not going to have to sweat the absolute details, but that's part of the reason that just for starters, that community established by nature for the sake of meeting everyday needs. In some sense, this would apply clearly to any any household, where, sometimes there's something that answers to the name household. If you have a couple of bachelor brothers living together and they live together their whole life, well, they have a little community there that it has a certain even naturalness to it. And they're meeting everyday needs. It's not the kind of most full sense of household, and in that allows us even to think more about what are the daily needs of persons. And isn't it interesting that the most obvious way and context that these are met is in a family that lives together.
Yeah. I just, that definition really excites me for a couple of reasons. First of all, a community designed by nature is very exciting. I love the way you put it, a treasure hunt to discover our design in nature. I love that. I think that's beautiful because in a certain sense, we're always discovering better who we are as human beings. And so first of all, just love that it's contextualized as a treasure hunt. I think that's so encouraging. But the other thing is the word everyday needs. Again, we tend to think of everyday as being kind of the mundane, the humdrum, the thing that happens over and over again. But really kind of what in this context, it really almost seems to give a validity and an importance to what is otherwise considered mundane, the everyday needs, the needs of a human person on a daily basis. No, that doesn't make it cheap because it's something they need every day. It's in fact things that recur over and over again that are part of them discovering who they are by design of nature.
That's a great
which
way of
I
putting
just
it.
think that's so beautiful because there are so many mundane day-to-day things that we encounter, one, as a married couple in a household with children, but even as individuals, we encounter mundane things we have to do over and over and over again, which can really beat you down unless you begin to see in them the dignity that they are, the recurring call to be fully human.
That's
so
great.
Exciting.
It is very exciting. And look, we can draw that out a little bit. I think this will fit exactly what you just said right there. When you consider, again, and here we're going to have the opportunity to go back to very basic key things that it's always worth revisiting about what it means to be human. There's always, given the constitution of human nature as soul and body, there's always this beautiful interweaving of the material and the spiritual, of that which of the body and that which is of the soul. Well, they are two principles of one being. So you can say, in a sense, the bodily and the spiritual are two principles of one life. And so when you think the daily needs, well, there's daily needs of being fed and sheltered. But being fed and sheltered, what do you immediately picture then? When you picture people eating together, kind of around a table. Well, consider another part of the daily needs is to have a certain kind of communication and personal presence and loving affirmation. This is a daily need. We need to be with people that love us. And it's fascinating. Again, one thing that we'll see again and again is how the natural plan always has this way of showing itself to have these facets that they don't just happen to fit together. They were fitted together. It's supposed to be this way. And so note how, we said earlier, well, two bachelor brothers, might live together. But I mean, we all know that's unusual in general, especially in a thriving society. By far, the vast majority of households are centered in a marriage, which gives this context of the love between spouses that then is the kind of dynamo from which comes then a love for children. And consider then that whole astounding dynamic of spousal relationship, parenting relationship. Talk about meeting daily needs. This is a natural design to give to people. Now, here we can especially emphasize children, but it's not just the children, it's everybody, what they need by being with their family. Right? We all know that to be orphaned is an exceedingly dramatic thing in human life.
Right.
So we naturally belong in a family where it again, to see us coming together, the material needs and the spiritual ones, or you might put it this way, we want, particularly for the children, the material needs really need to be met by someone who at the same time is loving them Otherwise, you have something monstrous, really.
Yes. And that just makes, while you're saying that, makes me think of course, that's what our materialist modern world would have a tendency to see the daily needs as material here. And then you have some emotional, spiritual ones here, rather than having them integrated. I mean,
Good
this is one
point.
of the
Right.
challenges of the modern world we live in, that everything is hyper specialized.
Good point.
We're dealing with your eyes here. We're dealing with your liver here. We're dealing with your, plumbing here. Whereas, human needs are actually, as you said so beautifully, it's this integrated, when the material is being met, there is an aspect of the spiritual, if it's being met correctly, that is also being satisfied, which I think is so important. And that makes me think of the bachelor brothers who live together. It's not that their community is not good, and it's not that it's not a real household to a certain extent, especially depending on how the two choose to live it. But it does seem to be the case that you can see why a household and a marriage and family context would actually be more capable of meeting more, or I dare say all, of the needs.
Right. Yeah.
Obviously there's a plan for a greater community also where other needs are met, right? So I won't say all the needs, but I'll say a lot of the fundamental needs, human needs, material and spiritual together, that it makes sense then if you have, even a religious household of women, for example. It's a real household of sorts, of course, by real commitment, but that's very different from the household of a family with parents and children. And also, I mean, I think Xenophon points this out. I think you shared this with me, that the household includes not only the spouses and their children, but also anyone that is attached to the household, including, elderly grandparents and aunt or an uncle, someone who works for the household. And I would even say, I don't know if Xenophon says this, but I, by extension, would like to say the things that belong to the household
He
too.
does say that.
Good, excellent.
He absolutely
I'm so
does.
glad to hear that Xenophon has great ideas like me.
No. It's true. Well, I mean, to some extent, you're seeing, you from having lived it also, you've perceived certain things that just fit. So it is interesting. This household is distinct from family. The term family is more referring to
That's a great
a
point.
number of people that are related in a certain way. And I think it's very important to point out, after our children leave our home, they are still members of our family, but they are not, properly speaking, members of our household anymore.
Yeah, that's
Household is a community of daily living.
Yeah.
And it stems from marriage, and it is the natural context for a family to live in. But it includes more. And given the nature of human life as bodily, it's just so beautiful, is that there are the material possessions. Aristotle is very, very clear on this, are parts of the household. The material things, the possessions. And what he does is he refers especially to all material things as being instruments that serve the good human life. So here, we can pivot just a little bit. The really cool thing here is that this is going to take us back to kind of, what did we get married for anyway? Well, we got to make this thing. We've been talking about what this household is. In a sense, we got married to make one of these. And there is an art of making them. For Aristotle, it was called oikonomia. We can just translate that as the art of household management. But I mean, really, this is central to all that we do at LifeCraft, because this is kind of the fundamental craft of crafting life every day in the home. This is one of the central know-hows. Any art or craft is a know-how that takes determinate set means to reach set ends. And so this is an art. Carpentry is an art. It takes set means to achieve set ends, but it's just a crafting in matter. The art of household management is a crafting fundamentally about persons. It's crafting a shared life every day, but that shared life is embodied. It does require material things. And so economia, the art of household management, is doing a lot of crafting in matter. It's consistently, and that's why I love this point of Aristotle, the way he puts it, is all the material things you own are instruments. They're instruments unto a full human flourishing, which flourishing is most of all happening on the fully human level, kind of rational and voluntary level, with most of all kind of primacy of the spiritual goods. But these spiritual goods are also always embodied. And so again, soul and body, spirit and matter are always beautifully interwoven. Where are they more interwoven than in this most natural of communities, this daily community, this natural community of daily life, the household, where it's woven together? And what do husband and wife do? It is their astounding joy, obligation, burden, challenge to craft this together every day of their life.
Well, just hearing you say that there's so many things in what you just said that make me excited all over again. It's just so exciting. But before we go on, I just want to say, you said a craft is for a set end. What would you say is the set end of the household?
And this, I'm not getting excited. This is where I just love how Aristotle saw this very clearly. And for me, as a Christian, I'm able to take what Aristotle says and then expand it and have it blossom into something even much greater without undoing what Aristotle said. So Aristotle would say it's for the sake of the good life. And his understanding of the good life is fundamentally a virtuous human flourishing. The goal of economia, the art of household management, is that this little community live a human life well.
Awesome.
And let me just quick follow up on that. This is where it's always about order. There's the real appreciation of the material, but this is where Aristotle insists on this, because he realizes this is where a lot of us are going to make a mistake. He was well aware, and we have to do a whole separate discussion on this, of the problem, the temptation to make wealth be too important. That's a whole fascinating side thing where Aristotle says,
wow.
That in note, by the way, economy, I'm saying that where you realize that's the word from which we get economy.
Yeah.
Right. And so there always has been a temptation to kind of reduce the art of household management down to the more, what we now call economic, the wealth aspects of it. And Aristotle is absolutely insistent. He puts this up front. We seek things, and we seek to attain things and own things and use things, always for the sake of people. It sounds like something Pope John Paul II would said, kind of like, being over having. This is the relationship of people and things. Aristotle is very, very explicit on this. Things are always for the sake of people. Things are always for the sake of people and their true flourishing. So economia, the art of household management, is always thinking first. This is the end you have to have in mind. He says, this is what the husband and the wife at the root of the household, he says, this is what they most intend. They intend the virtuous flourishing of the people. And he says the people, first of all, in the spousal relationship, and then the flourishing of the people in and through the parental relationship. So beautiful. But then how you arrange all the things in your household. What a complex art. How you use all the possessions, all those things that are part of the household, but they're part because they are the tools, the instruments of human life.
Wow. So I guess if we were to scroll back, when you asked me to marry you, what you were inviting me to do with you is you were saying, I want to ask you if you would join me in
this is getting
creating an environment, creating a place where first and foremost, the persons that come from us will have a context in which to flourish, fully actualize themselves as good people. And everyone else who's brought into that we will be responsible for, and will do our best to create an environment for them to flourish according to their design. And that we're going to collect all these things that are necessary for the flourishing of those people who have been given to us. And those things also, I want to invite you to help organize, orchestrate, take care of for their flourishing according to their design and their purpose.
Isn't that exactly what I said? I remember at Skyline Drive. I think he was playing the tape recorder. Isn't that why you said yes? Sheesh, baby.
Well, actually, I have to, in that context, confess that I feel like you shared this notion of the household with me probably about 15 years ago. So we've been married for how many years now, dear?
We don't have to mention that right
Okay,
now, but it's
so more than
about double
yes,
that.
about double that. And we've always been very good friends, and we have been very blessed with a great relationship, and we've worked on that too. And we have always seemed to want the same things in life, and so we worked on building our quote unquote household in an intentional kind of way. But as you started studying the philosophy of the household and family and became inspired by it, of course, building it on all the other philosophy you had been doing up to that time, and you started sharing these concepts with me, I have to say, about 15 years ago, it was this incredible aha moment. It's funny, right now I'm experiencing this kind of excitement in you describing this situation, that it's very much exactly what I felt when you started telling me about it 15 years ago. And it was actually, and this is part of the reason I wanted to do a podcast on it with you, is it really changed my experience of the household we were already living in and already building. Understanding this notion of the household being a place that comes into being by the promise and commitment of two people to one another, that's designed for the flourishing of all of its members. It really provided a context in which a lot of things that had been previously difficult and arduous, building a household is always arduous, but there was a way in which it was kind of really burdensome that I would struggle under. And sometimes there was a cognitive disconnect between, wait, this is what I want to be doing. Why am I so miserable? Type of thing. All of a sudden, this understanding of the household just alleviated a lot of those burdens and provided a context in which all of a sudden they made sense. And then they were just hard. They weren't, kind of a burden that you're grappling with. Why is this here? Why am I struggling with this? And maybe I could just get out, and you start looking for the exit sign. So anyway, it really made a huge difference for me. And that was part of the reason I wanted to just have this conversation about it, because in the hopes that, many people who are already living this or contemplating it, or thinking about this kind of thing, that understanding this kind of concept from the ancients might just provide the extra insight that in fact every heart, I think, is longing for.
A new angle, a new inspiration, and in new practical direction too.
Yeah, for sure.
So I have to go back and clarify one thing, because honestly, there was one thing that you left out of the proposal. That I'm sure you meant it to be in there, but I noticed as you're saying it that you didn't put it in there, and you just said, which you immediately went to, we're going to make a context where what children were blessed with can flourish. And the first thing in our ideal proposal scenario that we're talking about here is where the proposer says, first of all, I want to build together with you a little community, a context where you and I can flourish together.
Absolutely.
And from that, by an astoundingly generous, natural, providential, divine plan, our flourishing together bears the fruit. Our living in love together, our working this out together, bears fruit in the very structures and context that is best for children.
Yes, absolutely. So it's actually a prerequisite for the flourishing of the children.
It is. And key in this notion of household, and Aristotle saw it, it is a certain primacy in the sense of the root place of it. Always goes back to the marriage. It always goes back to the marriage. There's so much connected here. Just even when I think of, I go to a mentor and advisor and talking about something, a challenge with the children, a wise advisor saying, okay, what is this showing about what's lacking in your relationship with Sofia? Right. So very often how we're going to address, issues we're having related to our children is issues we're having and how we're relating to one another. Well, this is a sign. This is an instance of this broader principle that Aristotle saw when he puts it in an order, when he says the primary thing that the husband and wife intend is the flourishing of persons. in their relationship and in the relationship with the children. And this is not saying, it's not saying the household is more about us than is about the children.
Mm-hmm.
It's just saying this is where we begin. This is our first focus, but not a focus in any way remains turned inward,
Mm-hmm.
because of course the whole natural plan, again, remember, it's the treasure hunt.
Mm-hmm.
We're just discovering that we're constantly called, if we're going to do our relationship right, it calls us to generosity.
Mm-hmm.
It calls us to other-centeredness.
Mm-hmm.
It calls us to give our all first to one another and then to our children. And there's this beautiful way in which there is this fundamental directedness outward, kind of towards them, that never makes us lose ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
There's this beautiful kind of harmony of, in a sense, spouses put one another first, but that doesn't mean as though in some type of selfish way. You might even say it's so that they might better then
Mm-hmm.
be in a position to be generous ultimately to the Lord,
Mm-hmm.
by receiving children as a gift from his hands,
Mm-hmm.
and serving them through, in the context of our marriage and this larger thing we're making the household.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very important. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Of course,
Absolutely.
it's kind of like a prerequisite, or we say it's for the flourishing of all the members of the
Right.
community, right? And
Right.
of course, the spouses they're not just principals, they are actually members of the community. And the condition for their flourishing is the actualization of their marital relationship
Absolutely.
as spouses. Yeah.
Can I just, by the way, because I want to draw you out here in a second on more specifics, can you give specific examples of how, once we started to, again, we're guessing it was 15 years ago, once we started to more
Ish, yeah.
specifically think in these terms, how it changed it for you? But might I just throw out a line right now that I want to just say, because it helps us think more about the household. This comes to my mind a lot. Household is household is the place where human life begins and where it ends.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that adds it's not a definition, but it adds a great color, and it actually connects to some extremely important issues of our day that we won't be able to completely unfold. But at some point, I want to have a discussion with you about why we've done home births.
Mm.
I don't want to conflate the thing. When I say where life begins, I don't fundamentally mean that it means someone has to be born in the house, because there's reasons that someone might not be able to be born in the house. Fundamentally, life begins here because it begins in the marital embrace of husband and wife, and then the child being welcomed to wherever the child was born, then starting off the life there. This is where you start. This is the nest, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the nursery of human life. Much more that can be talked about, because given that it's interesting to talk about the fittingness and perhaps desirability, but we have to consider other things as regards thinking about home births. But
Mm-hmm.
but side point, but similarly, in dying in the home, it's where, now again, sometimes for medical reasons that might not be possible, but there's something even apart from where the person actually breathes his last.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about the end of human life for just a moment, where else would you want to be than at home?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a very important sense in which, in coming to the end of life, everyone should have a home to which you belong, in the context of which you die.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you had to be taken to the hospital there at the end, as it were,
Sure.
whatever.
Yeah.
But you belong to this household. So a house, this raises the issue of, households are a rich thing. It's more than just family. It's certainly more than just nuclear family. We need to talk about this generational aspect, because we're having this sense here of a household of being this larger community.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't it just interesting in passing to note, again, has to be a whole topic in itself, as you get older, it's just obviously of nature that you tend to start to need more help.
Mm-hmm.
And where is that help better given than in a home, not just for the sake of the elderly, but even for the sake of those who give it?
Mm-hmm.
That's part, perhaps, of a natural plan. All of this is part of just the different facets and unfolding this astounding natural community with these different aspects of a natural plan for daily human life. I mean, it's Xenophon says, when you get married, you actually are setting up the situation whereby you'll be taken care of when you're old.
Mm.
He doesn't say that in a crass kind of way. He's just basically saying this is how nature provides for you when you're older, that by having formed a household, this is where, God willing, you have children and you will still be there, or a certain proximity. So it just gives you the sense of that natural richness, again, whether we're able to do all of this at this point in time or not.
Yeah, and Xenophon even saying that it's the way that you prepare a place for yourself for when you are old and need to be cared for. The reason that's not purely pragmatic is because, again, the understanding of daily needs is not just bodily. It actually is also the spiritual and emotional. And so when he says you're preparing for yourself a place that you'll die, well, what if you can't die in that household? What if you are in a hospital or something like that? The reality is that the human emotional, psychological, spiritual care that is extended in the context of the physical needs being met is a way of kind of preparing your heart so that when you're dying, you're not alone. I mean, even if you had to die alone, if you had that experience, and again, the person who is raising children who are going to take care of him when he's older, he's also building relationships, right? So in a certain sense, the very raising of the children is actually preparing his heart to not be alone when he's dying. So I just think that part of this treasure hunt that we're discovering is that, in fact, human beings are so multifaceted and complex. And just when we think we've got everything in a little compartment, the reality is it's just much more beautiful than you even guessed.
Amen. It just kind of bursts. Yeah. It just bursts open further, and I think I hope just even that's why I love this notion. I want to work with it more and unfold it more in various contexts. This of household as a place where human life begins and where it ends. There's so much richness there. We just were blessed to see our son welcome his first baby girl into his new little home household with his wife. And it's just, there's nothing like kind of the child's first, now here she is. And now it brings something to fruition in the marriage, and they see all the more clearly this is what we've been preparing for. All the material aspects take on this new importance, and if we look, it just starts to dawn on you the substance and the richness of what is being crafted, what is being made here. Here's where it's almost like homemaking, as many people have pointed out, is often too weak a term. And I'm not necessarily suggesting we have to change it to household making, but I do, in any case, notionally want us to think in terms of household making. This is something, by the way, that not just the wife does. A husband and wife are household makers. This is a weakness in the way too many people speak about the traditional notion of home and marriage, where the wife is the homemaker. Now I grant there's something very beautiful and important being conveyed there, and I'm not against it all calling a wife a homemaker. I'm just kind of ratcheting it up to the next level and perhaps pushing people a little bit to recognize this is a very big Wendell Berry point. He said in one of his great essays, I love it. It was so striking to me, never forget it, when he writes, "Let me make myself clear because I know I'm treading in dangerous waters here. I want to assert that there's nothing more important for a woman or a man to do than to make a home together." And so again, there is a unique and beautiful sense in which the woman, we've done a podcast already, a woman is kind of the heart of the home.
Sure.
So there's a unique genius there of making the home really be a home. But nonetheless, to circle back to this broad thing called the household that has all these different facets, it's going to demand all that we have to give together, which brings us back to that proposal moment.
Yeah, exactly.
The traditional notion isn't that a man is coming saying, "I'd like you to make a home for me. Will you please live in my home and make it a home for me? And I'll be so happy when I get home from work that you've made it a home." I'm not trying to be unnecessarily controversial or facetious, although I am being a little facetious there. Again, there is a key sense in which the woman's going to be the heart. But this household thing, it's big. It's this whole project we're going to make together.
I just wanted the image that you drew up of our son with his new family. It just struck me that in some ways they don't fully understand what it is they've committed to, and how beautiful that it is that especially now with the baby, the bodily, the daily needs, day-to-day needs that they are meeting are slowly unfolding to them exactly, like fleshing it out. So yes, they do know in a certain sense, but not clearly or in the details. And it's actually the daily work, the daily needs of one another, and now their new baby is actually unfolding something of that commitment to them. So I think that's beautiful.
That's a great point. Can I stick with that for a moment? Because I think this is a really, really important theme. And this brings us to one of the key aspects of where our households today, the reality and our notion of them, how we think about them, how we do them, tends to be too thin. Another Wendell Berry point that I love, the modern home has become fundamentally consumptive, consuming and not productive. And so we've talked about this, and we've done some podcasting on that too, the importance of a certain kind of work in the home. Well, it's interesting. You point out, well, there's a certain amount of work that immediately begins by, welcoming the baby into the home. But then just what does that child, and God willing, those children need? They're going to need a lot more than just their diapers changed. They're going to need a lot more than just food to eat. Maybe part of what they need is the work of producing food. Maybe that's part of what's going to form them into the people that this daily community that's particularly ordered towards forming the young. What does it take to form up people? What are the daily needs, you might say, of children as regards being formed into the adults that they need to? What does it take to give them a sense of responsibility? Here's a big Xenophon thing where for them, again, it was taken for granted that there's all kinds of work, daily labor going on that is as soon as reasonable as practical, the children are invited into. And that's part of this complex thing called the household. They join the work of producing the things that meet the bodily needs of everybody. But again, I say, by a beautiful natural plan, you might say in a C.S. Lewis sense, by a deep magic, the very work that naturally was associated with producing the things that you bodily need was also itself fulfilling a need, by that work being a context for you forming a certain character, a certain sense of responsibility, and growing in your relationships. So to have this sense of the richness of that household and all the different kinds of working that we're going to do together there.
Yeah, it's so beautifully interconnected. It's in so many ways, it almost seems like, wow, how could we get this wrong? Which sadly we do, but it's really beautiful to see that interconnectedness.
Well, let's go back then to, I told you said that it really changed how so I already get the sense you've already said, and this is big in itself, and I hope maybe other people might find this too. I certainly find this too. When we think in these terms, we start to have these concepts, we start to have these principles, a sense of what the kind of natural plan here is for the household. We get this new view of, oh my goodness, even we're already doing certain things. It helps us understand better the dignity and importance of what we're doing. And how it all fits together. This makes a big difference of how we experience what we're doing. So I think already that's something very big. But it might also make us actually kind of do the things differently.
Yeah.
Not just having a new insight into what we're already doing. I think this notion actually will push us to have a better practical approach to what we're doing in the household. Is there anything that you can think of that you could share that was along those lines?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's kind of multi-layered. I mean, and I'm going to just talk about the abstract influence it made because it was actually very practical, and then maybe we can get a little bit more practical. But first and foremost, so about 15 years ago when we started really explicitating all this, we had emerging high schoolers and toddlers. So, I mean, and in between. And so in a certain sense, it was kind of literally like, this is like the most all hands on deck experience in our parenting life, just a lot of things coming to at the same time. So for me as a homeschooling mom, just, and full-time homemaker, so really no help with housekeeping or food prep or anything like that. There was just a lot of daily duties to be done. And it was very exhausting for me. And the thing that was maybe the most exhausting about it is the spiritual, psychological, and emotional needs of the children, which manifest on their timeline, not my own. So it was, make a plan and be interrupted a million times because so-and-so is having a breakdown right now, or so-and-so has cut their foot. And so there's just, in a certain sense, I had the experience of there were so many demands being made on me, practical demands that was overwhelming. And I almost feel like up until that moment, I was living my parenting life as though meeting the needs as they came. And it was working fine because there was a certain limit to those demands on me. And so I just kept meeting them as, oh, this is what I need to do now. This is what I need to do now. This is almost kind of like a linear presentation of what's next, what's next, what's next. And of course, I started drowning as what's next started coming down the conveyor belt super, super fast. And it just felt like it's more than I can handle. Kind of a burden. How can this be right? How can this be normal? How can it be natural? Now, of course, there are, practical things that we needed to change to make my burden easier at that time. And we certainly worked toward that. But the first and fundamental thing was the way I was seeing those things coming at me. When I started having a sense of the household as being a place designed for the flourishing of its members, and for children in particular who are growing, that implies a certain kind of change and growth pattern, then all of these things that started coming at me, all these duties and jobs, et cetera, were not just kind of the next thing off the conveyor belt, but part of a bigger picture that there was a set end that I was orienting all those practical details to. So did I go to bed less tired? No, I was still dealing with all those issues, but psychologically and emotionally, I wasn't beaten down and kind of, oppressed
crushed.
by it, or kind of, I didn't go to bed feeling like I had lost the race, because it was all part of a bigger picture that needed to be addressed for the sake of the achievement or accomplishment of this thing that was a much bigger picture than the child that came up to me saying, I'm hungry, 25 minutes after I'd just given everybody lunch. Right. So so that was a very, very, I know that sounds abstract and not practical, but in a certain sense, your interior orientation toward these things makes all the difference.
I think that's huge. That's a beautiful point.
So my mom, I love to quote this. My mother had 10 children in 15 years, and she homeschooled all of us and taught us all music and was an incredible woman. And I remember one time saying to her, Mom, how'd you do it? It just seems incredible. And she said, first of all, she shared with me, she used to cry on the back porch where no one would see her. She would go where her kids couldn't see her. But then she said everything changed for her when she did two things. First of all, she said she stopped feeling sorry for herself. And the other thing she said, which I just has so stuck with me, and I've kind of continued to unpack it through every moment of my parenting life. She said, I stopped living on the periphery of my life. And in a certain sense, seeing the bigger context, understanding the daily demands on you as part of a household, which is not an in the moment thing. It's an in the moment in the context of a lifetime. And you jump in with both feet instead of taking care of what's coming at you off the conveyor belt so you can go and sit down and take a break, or when is it Friday, or when do I go on vacation? She said, I stopped living on the periphery of my life. And so for me, this understanding of the household was an invitation to stop living on the periphery of my life. I didn't realize I was doing that.
You've told me that before, of course. It's such an amazing line.
Yeah.
There's so much in there.
Yeah. And I think
it's so easy. How many of us are living on the periphery of our own life?
Absolutely.
If we really stop and think about that, what that means.
Yes. And actually, if we think about what that means, it actually strikes us what a tragedy that is.
Right.
We're not living inside of our life. We're not living inside this design in nature that is meant to be discovered for all of its glory. Yeah. Right. So that was a really big thing for me, is that it created a context that allowed me to stop living on the periphery of my life. And then in a very practical way, of course, with emerging teenagers and things like that, then there are always the specific details of moral formation, habit formation, appetite formation of the children, even the young children, and understanding the bigger context. We're trying to create something in which our children are going to flourish and be able to most become themselves. That automatically gives you a compass on which you say, no, I'm sorry, you can't have a sixth, Oreo cookie or something like that, or
Yes, yes.
you become, as a mother, you become worn down by your children constantly begging, can I please, can I please, can I please, can I please? This gives you a context in which to maintain your strength and say, to direct them in the direction that will help them best achieve the virtuous end that we're striving
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah.
And so it gave me a very particular kind of courage to continue to implement things that, of course, were, it was the foundation of what we want to do with our children. But in the practical details, very often that vision or that idea just became, obscured, and I would just feel overwhelmed. I don't know what to do type of thing. And
Yeah.
it gave me something against which I could measure the daily requirements, and then of course it was certainly a thing that allowed me, in my daily observation of the children, to come to you and say, sweetheart, I think so-and-so really needs such and such, or this thing that we're doing is not really working right now. We need to come up with a better system for. And I just think that both of us have really grown. It's created an environment that has required us to be more minutely attentive to the psychological and emotional needs of our children, and continue to press us to try to figure out what is the best physical distribution of our home to best accommodate that.
And may I interrupt right there? That's such a great point, and say, just because right now is the moment to say it. And again, that great deep magic, the astounding plan, it gave us the incomparable, irreplaceable context to forge our relationship.
Yes, absolutely.
That we had to listen to one another, and work together. There isn't anything that could bind two human beings more closely together than this effort, than this noble work of discerning together and executing how to craft this community, especially for the sake of the children that you mutually love.
Yeah.
There's just nothing like that. And if I may,
yes, and I'm so profoundly grateful for that opportunity.
I'm too.
So
and
profoundly
it makes me,
grateful for it.
Think of also when it gave me a context, and this, again, the beautiful plan, where you started to see these things. You bring this to my vision. You bring this to my awareness. Even if maybe I'm the guy who had even brought the idea to you, it's one thing to know something kind of at the speculative level. It's another thing in the concrete aspects of life. And then here in the actual trenches of life, where life is lived, not in the classroom, for goodness sake, then you are saying, okay, in view of these things that you've been saying, here's what we need to do here. And here, John, is what I need from you. And this is where, for me, a huge, part of this whole discovery has been, to take the term from earlier and use a slightly different way, I can't live on the periphery of your life, which so often in this modern context, when the man goes away and has another job, he is living on the periphery of his wife's life,
which is his life.
And
it's his household.
Should be his life. And his wife, I think, often experiences the husband as being on the periphery of her life. And it's very hard for her to not stay on the periphery of her own life, because she doesn't want to go into this very challenging, somewhat scary place alone. So we need to go in there together, because this is the way the natural design is. It's going to require both of us and demand the most of both of us. And so that's what gives us the opportunity. So you saw that, you started to bring that to my attention, and I then very concretely, and asking myself questions like, okay, so how does this is, again, part of the problem. Men tend to think in terms of, how can I, quote, help out at home? There's a problem here. Again, there's an appropriate primacy to the place of the woman as the heart of the home, in setting the spirit, and kind of having the genius for the basic kind of material, especially set up within the home. But it doesn't make it simply be her home. So, while yes, there has to be the respect of a man for her kind of proper genius, and how she has a certain priority in discerning certain things there, still, if he just sees it as, well, I need to come help her in her work. This is a very simple example for me. I had to get beyond seeing my doing dishes as somehow helping you. No, these are our dishes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not helping you. I'm doing the dishes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yes, obviously it's helping you too, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this to take ownership of the things that we're doing together here, we have to. Every couple is going to do it differently, coming to that right division. But in a kind of complementarity, in a reasonable division, is going to be most practical. It's going to work best. But of course, it's a, we should say it's more of a Wendell Berry makes this point. It should be a distinction of work and a difference in work without being too deep a division,
Yeah,
because we're very much
that's
we're
great.
doing one thing ultimately. And so that made me realize, no, when I'm cleaning in the home, when I'm training our children to clean in the home, I'm not going outside my box.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is I mean, what are we making together anyway,
Mm-hmm.
was our title.
Yeah.
And that's where we need to see this household. It's big. It's much more than just the diapers and the dishes and so forth. But the diapers and dishes, that's all part of it. And even if in a traditional setup, the woman is going to be doing more of that, nonetheless, well, what are we making together? I'm very much there with you and supportive of you. And again, according to the particular division, I mean, for instance, we did determine I actually take a priority in the dishes because you take a priority in the making of the food, and it just is only
Mm-hmm.
reasonable that I step up and see that as fundamentally something in the Great Division that I need to do. And that's
Mm-hmm.
just one little example, but it comes of being in the zone of how can we best divide this work in this common project of what we're doing here at home. And for a man, again, this is another topic that's so related to it. How do I integrate that with a sense of my profession? This is challenging. I have
Mm-hmm.
to give an appropriate attention to my profession. But I think that my view, by and large, men are over prioritizing their profession and not recognizing to what extent they need to be central to this shared project of this thing
Mm-hmm.
called the household.
Yeah, so they don't see their profession as the center of who they are, and the household is peripheral to their life.
That their wife does, and that they help their
Yeah,
wife out every now and then
yeah,
while fundamentally focusing on their profession.
yeah.
I see why time-wise it can feel like that, but that shouldn't be the attitude.
Yes. And there's also another reason for that is that, of course, in looking at the flourishing of the household, there are going to be certain, between the husband and the wife, certain things that members of the household need that are better met by one or the other. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why we culturally and traditionally, we see a certain preponderance of women doing more of the domestic tasks, because it's not because dishes can't be done by a man or that diapers can't be changed by a man. But remember what we said is when we meet the bodily needs, we are also meeting spiritual and emotional needs. And so there's a way in which a woman does these practical things that meet the psychological and emotional needs of a child, especially the very young, in a way that a man doesn't meet them in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
The way
That's a
a
great
man
point.
meets the children's and other household members' needs, especially as they grow older, becomes, in a certain sense, more front and center. The way a man, the spiritual and emotional needs of a child as they get older are better met by the father than by the mother. This is not to say that the mother then just completely disappears. But so that's the kind of, again, very practical. You're on the ground, you're having to make a lot of practical decisions about how we do things in a household. What's our guiding principle? The flourishing of the members of the household. What are the things? And we ask the question, what are the things that they need? And it helps us begin to make a decision of how we distribute practical tasks.
Amen. Amen. And we'll need to talk about it in another context, but I want to just quick further point as regards the issue of profession. Because I think it needs to be brought up here, at least to say this. I think a man's profession is fundamentally ordered towards the flourishing of the household.
Mm-hmm.
Now, granted, there can be certain professions that have a kind of close connection to the common good that can demand a commitment for the broader common good that could even be to the prejudice of the household.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, if you have a soldier,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, So these are complex things. We need to recognize that the family, the household isn't just simply turned inward. But nonetheless, I think it's an important principle that we generally think in terms of the husband's profession as ordered towards the flourishing of the household, and thus we judge it in those terms.
Yeah.
Where am I going to work? How long am I going to work? Am I going to accept this
Sure.
raise? Where am I going to take a position? It's not fundamentally about the man's career, right? Again, understandably, sometimes a wife does maybe take into account, gosh, this profound dream that my husband has. How important is it that I encourage him in pursuing this? These are delicate matters, and I want to overly simplify, and one can fall off the cart on either side. But I still go back to the principle, and then it has to be worked out of we put each other and this thing that in getting married, we committed ourselves to the household, especially then when the household has children. There's this sense in which it has taken on this wonderful life of its own that demands that we order our activities towards it. And that I just say, from a man's perspective, I have to be willing to give up certain things. And again, one could go overboard with that. There's the legitimate desire to pursue your craft outside the home and your profession. Granted, and I'm not just giving a nod to that. That is serious. But that somehow at the same time, as I have fundamentally committed, if I am getting married, I have fundamentally committed to accept where the broader common good absolutely demands it. I have committed to put this household first.
Yeah. Yeah.
And period.
Yeah. Good.
So.
I just to bring our conversation back to a little bit, I just want to share one other thing with you, how this notion of the household really made a really big practical difference in my life as a homemaker in our home. And that is, it's kind of funny to admit this, but I love saying this because I suspect that a lot of women have the same experience, married and unmarried. I would describe myself as kind of well, I don't know, it's somewhat jocosely, but also it has a seriousness to it as a closet feminist, in the sense that I have a great sympathy with women who take the feminist line, who say, oh, when women get married and they're raising kids, all the unbelievable, like she's a drudge. She has all this work she needs to do, and for what? And nobody recognizes her. And blah, blah. There's a real sense in which I can really, partially experientially, I understand where they're coming from.
Absolutely.
I would say that I had before I understood this notion of the household and of myself as a part of a bigger context that was working toward the flourishing of the individuals given to me in the household, a lot of those tasks were really menial and really burdensome. And so I feel like the fact that we don't really have a sense of the household as such, it's just a place where bodily needs get taken care of, not in the sense that Aristotle said bodily daily needs, but just bodily needs are taken care of. And so much of that burden falls on the shoulders of a woman behind closed doors, often preventing her from being able to go out and be free and do things by herself, et cetera. If you don't see that in a bigger context, all those things would be incredibly burdensome and super unfair. And especially if you add to that, if your husband's attitude toward what goes on inside the walls of your house is your business and not his,
absolutely,
then you begin to see this incredible discrepancy between, a man's job where he gets to go to the office and gets to go to the bathroom whenever he wants to and not be interrupted, midway and talking to adults and having, conversations and closing the door to his office when he's had too much. These are things that are not afforded to a woman raising children in the home. And so it feels extremely unfair if that's his attitude, right? And so one, she's alone. Two, she's saddled with a tremendous amount of menial tasks that are very burdensome.
Right.
Those tasks become transformed. First of all, if your spouse shares them with you, whether he's there next to you, shoulder to shoulder, doing them, but in the sense of shares the burden of responsibility. Nay, I'll say he actually takes the primary burden of responsibility for the flourishing that happens in the household. and is in it with you with his intention. And then on top of that, if you see those individual activities, those frankly tiring and burdensome activities, as being for the sake of, for the flourishing of those who have been given to you, you begin to have a sense that you're actually doing something really extraordinary.
Amen.
And otherwise, I don't know how you would see doing dishes over and over again as something extraordinary. You know, I mean, that's a little bit saying, oh, this, you know, potato is a piece of exquisite wedding cake. You know, it's not, unless you see it as an act of love, of creating an environment for the flourishing of those around you. And so I have to say, that's part of the reason I also wanted us to have a podcast on this, because I just think, robbed of that notion of the household, women who are really desiring something like the household we're talking about go into it and then all of a sudden discover themselves completely buried under a lot of menial tasks. And then they begin to just hear the feminist rant of, yeah, it's not fair. Yeah, I could be doing better somewhere else. Yeah, people would recognize me if I were outside of this context. And so, and even a lot of the feminists, I have to say, people who are, I just hear a lot of really hurting women. And there's a reason that they're hurting. And part of it is they've been deprived of a context. And the household is that context that redeems a lot of this. And so that has just made, I've just been able to, it's not that I don't live on the periphery of my life anymore. Being able to live fully inside my life has become an incredible blessing and gift of richness to me, where I go to bed tired differently now. And so I just think that is a huge difference. It makes all the difference.
Well, I am extremely grateful to God and grateful to you. And it is a great blessing. And we've got a lot of work to do, because the more that you see of this great truth, the more you realize what an incredible, noble, demanding project this is, that will never fully succeed in.
Yes. And of
course, will always have deeper to go into it.
And the work is part of the treasure hunt. So it's not really like, wow, we have a lot of work to do. Exactly. It's more like, wow, God grant us the time to keep doing the work. Because the reality is in this design of nature for this community, is that the work always produces the flourishing.
It does. And it's the flourishing of people. And it's always about people, which in God's plan are the people that we're closest to, that we love the most, that we most want to live with. This is the natural community where life begins, where life ends, but by the way, not just by the way, and is the daily context in between. So what greater thing could we have signed up for? What greater project could we have embarked upon together? And the more that we get a sense of the richness of this household, just from a natural level, then of course we haven't even really talked about the supernatural fruition, the way that is preparing souls for their ultimate home. Because that's what ultimately earthly households are for. You know, I seek to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. Ultimately, our human household is the kind of foyer, the entree point. It's where we learn how to live in the house of the Lord, which is the only house that will be the true fullness and that will never cease and where we'll never have to say goodbye.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, thanks so much, dear, for that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to be continued, thanks all for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in this episode of The Intentional Household. If you've enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, and leave a rating or review. If you have any topic requests, please send them to lifecraftgroup@gmail.com. For our Wednesday reflections, free courses, reading groups, and live events, please visit life-craft.org.